Welcome to today's Socialist Action webinar. I'm really excited to be here with our two speakers. My name is Mark Ostapiak. I am a writer for Socialist Action. I write under the pen name. I write under the pen name of Mark Rome, and I'm on the national and political committees of Socialist Action. For this webinar today, we are going to be discussing the radical history of pride. Now, in an era of corporate sponsorship of pride and police participation of pride, two things that Socialist Action is very much opposed to, this topic is very vital. Social movements and the gains from previous social movements and struggles are always dynamic when the ruling rich have state and economic power. In the midst of this, the scales of justice either tip towards the mass movements for social change or toward the forces of reaction and the status quo. It all depends on the relationship of social and political forces. The goal of Socialist Action, the sponsor and organizer of tonight's webinar, is to participate in, learn from, and challenge challenge for power with the energy of mass united mobilizations with the best fighters in all social and political movements for justice, so that one day we may achieve change that is so thoroughgoing, so deeply rooted, that a new society can be born that is fundamentally different than the one in which we live today. Socialist Action is a revolutionary socialist organization that has continuity with movements for social justice and socialism dating back over 150 years. This evening, our two wonderful presenters will be speaking, as I mentioned before, the radical history of pride and the LGBTQI movements. And we hope to learn something from the struggles that our comrades this evening will be talking about. Our speaker tonight sent an email out earlier today mentioning that there was a demo in front of a football stadium for the Euro 2020 final between Germany and Hungary. And the protesters swamped the plaza in front of the stadium, passing out rainbow flags in protest of Hungary's new law banning display or promotion of homosexuality to anyone under 18. So today's event is a very apt event for such a situation. And with that said, I want to encourage people to subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube page, check out our website at socialistaction.org. And without further ado, I'm very, very pleased and excited to welcome my friend and comrade, Anne Montague. Anne is a longtime out lesbian feminist activist in the union movement in SEIU 503 in Oregon, and is a writer for Socialist Action, and is also on the national and political committees of Socialist Action. And we have our other speaker this evening that I'll introduce first, and then we'll let Anne begin. Our second speaker is our comrade John Wilson, who's a socialist since 1954, who has been active in the queer liberation movement since 1970. John is also on the steering committee of Queer Ontario and is on the Central Committee of Socialist Action Canada. With that said, I'm going to hand it over to Anne Montague.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really excited about this, and I'm hoping that everyone will learn something new about the foundations of our radical movement. I decided that there were two things I wanted to talk about, which was the early lesbian feminist movement and also AIDS, ACT UP, AIDS activism. And probably most people think that after Stonewall, the first mobilization after that was the following year in Manhattan. But actually, Martha Shelley, who was a lesbian, wanted to organize a United Front march through Greenwich Village. She felt like it shouldn't wait after the upsurge at the Stonewall. And she contacted Madison Society, which is a gay male organization, and also lesbians. And they actually had a march, about 300 people through Greenwich Village, ending with a rally in Christopher Park. And this was sort of the impetus for creating a new organization known as the Gay Liberation Front. But by 1970, lesbian activists started leaving to form their own organizations. It was clear that lesbian oppression was as much misogyny as it was homophobia. So quickly, the sexism became too much, and lesbians, many who were also active in the women's liberation movement. Lesbian activist Del Martin, who wasn't really particularly a radical, but was an excellent lesbian organizer, wrote to the Advocate, a gay male newspaper magazine, which it still is. And she wrote, goodbye to the male chauvinism of the homophile movement. Gay is good, but not good enough, so long as it is limited to white males only. There were numbers of groups and collectives who started to form, but probably the most radical foundational movement for the fight for lesbian liberation was the Furies Collective, founded in 1971. The Furies, who were located in Washington, D.C., probably were not the first to use the term lesbian feminist, but they were certainly the first to use the words for the banner headline for their publication. And it was the Furies Lesbian Feminist Monthly. They had 5,000 subscribers across the country, in the Midwest, many in the Midwest, which always kind of surprised me, on the East and the West and throughout the country. Once a month, they would drive their car to Atlanta, where the Sojourner Truth Press would publish their production, because they were the only female-owned press in the nation. While the largest revolutionary socialist organization or party at this time was debating whether the slogan "gay is good" was accurate or even true or should ever be used, the Furies were talking about systems of power. And when the mainstream women's liberation groups were doing consciousness raising and talking about interpersonal struggles as women, lesbian feminist Furies and other lesbians did not need their consciousness raised. They very well understood that their oppression was systemic, and they were moving on to theory. What separates the Furies Collective was that in 1971, their dedication was to promoting discussion of theory. They considered themselves revolutionaries and used their publication to reach out to their 5,000 and their friends who were discussing class, race, patriarchy, capitalism, sexuality, violence against women, and imperialism. That's what has made them important. Their newsletter had ideological pieces, feminist history, lesbian history, and political analysis that was being discussed across the country. They had big plans. The way Charlotte Bunch explained it, we saw ourselves as having a role in the women's movement, developing an ideology that interprets the world, historical forces, objective conditions in the future. We wanted to be able to talk very clearly to women about revolution. We also needed humor and fun, as we didn't go mad from male supremacy and heterosexual domination. This was the Cultural Revolution. As a Marxist, I'm currently been studying a relatively recent theory of social reproduction. And so it was amazing to me to see that in 1971, they connected the enforcement of compulsory heterosexuality with women's oppression generally, and were critiquing the nuclear family and capitalism. They were pivotal in presenting a lesbian presence in the women's movement. They were separatists, but there were a lot of separatist groupings that were not having these discussions. The Furies were purposely in Washington, D.C. They lasted only 2 years, but it's not about the length of their existence, but they were the first clear eyed assessment that in practice was optimistic and energizing. They wanted to understand sexism and its relationship with class and race and capitalism. They wanted to intervene in society to build a world that was different and a new way of thinking. There was anger at the systems of sexism and male domination, but there was also optimism and idealism. Those discussions of class and race in 1971 remained with everyone who read that publication and discussed it with their friends. It was formative, and they're engaging the concept of interlocking oppressions was radical. And most important, this was not coming from academics looking to advance their career by using our movement, like we see some today. This was all rooted in their material experience of double oppression as experienced by women and lesbians. They saw themselves as part of the growing movement to destroy sexism. When the collective broke up, they brought forth what would become known as lesbian culture. Two members started Olivia Records so women's music could be distributed. Others started literary journals. Some were poets, authors. They used art and photography to make lesbians visible, and the music festivals, which were safe lesbian spaces. 10 years later, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but with the AIDS crisis came to some extent a re-coming together with the suffering of our brothers. I have a favorite quote from a gay man who I think this was in San Francisco, I'm not sure, but and he had said, I love it because it was so truthful. He said, our hospitals are full of lesbians. They're caring for us. They're with us as we die. And we didn't treat them very well, but we're sure glad they're here now. There was also lesbian blood sisters that collected. There's a great need for blood because of the need for transfusions. And the first one's actually in San Diego, and they organized it and they expected 60 lesbians to show up, and they had 600. So that these things they were doing, of course, are very traditional women's roles in terms of caring, but they were also active, very active in the activism, including ACT UP. So Sarah Schulman, who just wrote a book about, and she had interviewed, she was an active activist, and she interviewed all the ACT UP activists who are still living, and wrote a book called Let the Record Show. But there's a piece in the beginning which gives a good broad description of what ACT UP was, who they were, and what they achieved. And I thought for people that weren't familiar, it would be a good idea to read that out. In just 6 years, ACT UP New York, a broad coalition of activists of all races, genders, sexualities, and backgrounds, changed the world. Armed with desperation and creativity, it took the AIDS crisis with the took on the AIDS crisis with a multifaceted attack on corporations, institutions, governments, and individuals who stood in the way of AIDS treatment for all. They stormed the FDA and the NIH in Washington, D.C., started needle exchange programs in New York, took over Grand Central Terminal, and fought to change the legal definition of AIDS to include women. They weaponized art to push their agenda, battled and beat the New York Times, Catholic Church, and the pharmaceutical industry. Their activism in its complexity transformed the lives of people with AIDS and the bigoted society that had abandoned them. I think there are three components to any successful social movement: anger, serious organizing, and mass actions independent of any power structure. In the United States, that means independent of the Democratic Party. But it also takes a spark. And with ACT UP, that spark was Larry Kramer. In the 1980s, young, healthy gay men were dying and no one cared. There was silence everywhere. Larry Kramer resigned from the board of the Gay Men's Health Crisis. 10,000 gay men had been diagnosed and 5,000 had died. Kramer was angry. He said, "We have sat back and let ourselves be knocked off man by man without fighting. This is more than denial, it is a death wish." Following this, silence equal death signs appeared on walls and scaffolding all over lower Manhattan. Their anger turned into action and ACT UP was formed. They made activism a vital part of the gay movement. There is one action that stands out. This was a closing down of the Food and Drug Administration in Rockville, Maryland in 1988. It was a major feat of activism and also intelligent organization. ACT UP joined together gay men, lesbians, and supporters around the country. It was one of the largest demonstrations since the war in Vietnam. Hey, hey, FDA, how many people have you killed today? Fight back, fight AIDS. Protesters blocked the doors and walkways. Roads were blocked. There was a banner, Federal Death Administration. Eventually, police officers wearing surgical gloves, which they apparently thought would protect them from getting AIDS, and helmets rounded up hundreds of protesters. This was all shown on the national news. But this was just the beginning. ACT UP had prepared for this national attention. Part two of the demonstration became the educational process. They knew this was their chance to talk to the nation. It was part of the plan and they were ready. In their numerous meetings with the press, they showed them how to communicate treatment issues to the public. They had been working for weeks conducting teach-ins for ACT UP activists so they would be prepared when they went on television and radio across the nation after their action at the FDA. Their media tour demanding a shortened drug approval process showed that they knew every detail of complex FDA procedures. In 1990, activists demanded a seat at the table where they were discussing the clinical trials. Eventually, the bureaucrats relented and ACT UP was added to the AIDS clinical trial group. This was a first. But they did not stop at the FDA. They shut down the stock exchange, protesting the price of AZT, the only approved drug at the time. They invaded St. Patrick's Cathedral in coalition with WHAM, Women's Health Action and Mobilization. They confronted New York's Cardinal Joseph O'Connor, who had a campaign against condom distribution. They interrupted CBS Evening News and PBS during Operation Desert Storms with "Fight AIDS, Not Arabs." They shut down Grand Central Station and hung a banner, one AIDS death every 8 minutes. They had mass die-ins and protests. I think the lesson for today is mass struggle does not come from academic theory. And as long as we are stuck with the neoliberal attack on collective identity and unified struggle, we are stuck in a bubble. We must move move past individualism to the reality of the furies, interlocking oppressions of class and race, and ACT UP's consistent activism. Thank you.
Wonderful. And thank you so much. That was highly enlightening, very, very awesome presentation. I have some questions for later. And I also want to encourage people to ask questions in the chat if you haven't already. And I'm going to take a moment to encourage people once again to click the subscribe button there on our YouTube page so that you can subscribe and follow up on our webinars, which happen every other Wednesday. So we're having one tonight. We're not going to have one next Wednesday, but the following Wednesday. And I also want to encourage people to check out our website, socialistaction.org. And finally, I want to let people know that we are an activist, revolutionary socialist organization involved in many different struggles, including the struggle we're talking about today. And if you're interested in being involved, check out our website and get in touch with us. Our contact information is there. With that said, I don't want to take any more time away from our second featured speaker of the night, John Wilson. He's a socialist since 1954 and active in the queer liberation movement since 1970. John is on the steering committee of Queer Ontario in Canada and is also on the Central Committee of Socialist Action USA's sister party, Socialist Action Canada. And with that said, John, take it away. John, sorry to interrupt you, but I think you are muted.
Okay. You can hear me now, all right? Okay. The early gay movement, known as gay liberation, was characterized by democratic, independent militant groups, such as Gay Alliance Toward Equality in Toronto and Vancouver. Working class people, a significant number from the socialist left, comprised the majority of leaders and activists at that time. Groups that were organized at that time were organized in the mid-70s, held democratic conventions which elected delegates, decided policy and actions. We were very much in the streets movement, although numbers are relatively few in the beginning. Campaigns around particular issues were democratically accountable on a community level. I must point out that the early movement was very much dominated by white gay men, and lesbians and Black, Indigenous, and people of color were not represented in the leadership of the movement at that point. I mean, that's on the way to being corrected now, and over maybe since the early 80s, but that was the case at that time. I think that was probably inevitable in the context of those times, but I thought it was necessary to put that in there. Well, the main issues taken up early on were around civil rights issues, protests around specific issues, and individual cases around gay, lesbian employment issues. There was a different approach from what's predominant now. In Ontario and BC, but not only there, people operated on the basis of what was known as the gay rights strategy. The thinking was this: the end goals of liberation were, and unfortunately still are, a long way off. We need to take up issues that immediately affect our lives in the society. Movements need victories to sustain momentum. Goals need to include rights and protections that are realizable in the shorter term. Struggles around these rights can be a valuable tool in educating ourselves as well as the straight population. This analysis proved true earlier than we expected. Lobbying efforts were backed up with mass action, movement accountability, and refusal to sacrifice the rights of our minorities in order to accommodate or compromise with the existing order. By the late 80s, we had won major victories, legal victories mainly, notably the inclusion of sexual orientation in the provincial and federal human rights codes. As many of you will know, the movement is very different from the early period. Community-based groups declined after the first significant victories. The leadership today is self-appointed, not elected. The goal is assimilation, not liberation. The assumption is that the major goals have been met and are permanent. The LGBT establishment is primarily middle class, white, and privileged, and predominantly male. They're not interested in the problems of queer, poor people and sex workers. They would like minorities like this to disappear, Victories for trans activists, which is one of the more encouraging developments in the last few years, have been mainly won by transgender people themselves and their allies. The establishment prefer to rely on lawyers and courts, certainly not mass action in the streets. The degeneration of Pride is a prime example of this. But I think that there are signs that regeneration of the movement can happen, even possibly in the relatively near future. In the struggle over corporate pride and police in it, new organizations and networks have developed. In Toronto, the National No Pride in Policing Coalition, is an outstanding example of that, NPPC. This group in 2020 organized a live rally in City Hall Square on Pride, which drew 2,000 to 3,000 people, well outnumbering the virtual event of official Pride. NPCC was critical in reversing a decision to allow police back into the parade in 2019. This despite the decision of the vast majority of Pride's membership to ban the cops for 3 years. In Canada, as well as the US, Black Lives Matter has had a massive impact. In my opinion, there's been a qualitative change in consciousness on systemic racism. BLM halted the Pride Parade to protest police presence and to advance other important issues. Effectively, there was a sort of an informal coalition between Black Lives Matter and activists who are opposed to corporate pride. In Canada, particularly, the discovery of 215 children buried in an unmarked grave site at one of the notorious residential schools has led to profoundly increased consciousness of Indigenous oppression. Well, I think I will leave it there for now.
Okay. Thank you, John. Enlightening presentation. And once again, this event is organized by Socialist Action. We're a revolutionary socialist organization based in the United States. We have our sister party, Socialist Action Canada, which John is a member of. And want to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube page by clicking the subscribe button. And also check us out on socialistaction.org. And lastly, I want to encourage people to, if you have questions, we'd love to hear them. Type them in the chat and we will field them. While we wait to have people put their questions in the chat, who have very, relatively speaking, fewer years experience than our comrades Ann and John in the struggle we're discussing this evening, the radical history of pride. There were some things that were brought up in both, and I'm gonna sort of, this question is for both John and Ann, but Ann, you mentioned that the Furies Collective was focusing on systems of power, focusing on theory about class, race, violence of women, and imperialism, critiquing capitalism. And then John, you mentioned that the impact of Black Lives Matter on the struggle, on the LGBTQI struggle in the United States and Canada. So I'm thinking about how can we see the impact of adjacent struggles that are intertwined, both from the past and, as you mentioned, the Furies critiquing race and class and capitalism and imperialism. And then John, you mentioned, the impact of BLM, another struggle that informs the struggle for LGBTQI liberation. So we have adjacent struggles for racial justice back in the 70s and now today. Can we maybe expand on this idea of how those adjacent and intertwined struggles informed one another, past, present, and maybe even projecting into the future? So that's what I'd like to put out there for the panelists here, and I'm happy to have anybody go first. Anne or John, would you like to field that? Anne, okay, and then John, we'll let you go next.
Okay.
I was thinking, just because this is something I've been involved with, and if it's okay, I want to show this book. It's called Out in the Union, and it's the history of gay, lesbian, and trans people in the union movement, starting from 1965, and it's written by Miriam Frank, and it's really an excellent book. And for me, most of the intersection that I've been involved with has been in terms of within the union movement. So they are working class members. And more recently, we were talking, it's called the Lavender Caucus, is our caucus. And they are talking about that when there were very large demonstrations in Portland, like 30,000 people. And we had the discussion, and those people that were in Portland, they organized a contingent in the Black Lives Matter marches, and which I have to admit, it surprised me a little bit, but it was great. And I just think the consciousness of these other struggles is just affecting them. And then we have a lot of gay and lesbian members who are working, that we represent in like nursing homes and home care and all of these essential jobs. And we had nursing home workers who went out on strike, large number of them who are members of our community. And and they went on strike for about 3 weeks because of conditions in the nursing homes. And then again, there was that, solidarity. So I think it's really just encouraging to be in a working class organization and working for justice and equality, and the basic idea of solidarity, and an injury to one is an injury to all. I am kind of interested, I kind of mentioned to John about that, I'm really interested in how, because we don't have anything close to a Labor Party in our country, about the NDP and what their role has been historically. I'd be interested in that too.
Excellent. So John, it sounds like you have the floor, based on, my queries, and now Anne has added that onto that, the NDP. So if you would like to respond to that, we would love to hear it.
Okay. One thing I would like to mention in terms of struggles coming together, or adjacent struggles, so to speak. In 1981 in Toronto, there was massive raids on gay bathhouses, which provoked a really mass response. And one of the people who spoke at the first demonstration was the mother of a Black man who had been murdered by Toronto police. And she identified with the demonstration, and I'm sure the organizers held out for her, got in contact with her. But there was a beginnings of a sort of a coalition between the Black communities and gay community and lesbian communities. Well, that's just sort of an example of how that can happen. Unfortunately, this process I discovered, of the sort of respectabilizing of the gay movement and takeover by the self-appointed leaders, was already in process at that time. So that wasn't really followed up properly, except by some, some more militant activists, but we were in a minority. Now about the New Democratic Party and the labor movement, the unions. These were two of the first major supporters of LGBT rights, and actually the first union that passed a resolution in favor of those was the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, which is a fairly independent militant unions and still is for that matter. For example, their staff are paid no more than are paid no more than the highest paid people in the workforce. So they're not, none of them are buying boats or mansions like some unions. And the union movement is, even though it's fairly timid and conservative in many ways, in Canada is quite a bit stronger still than in the US, I think. And it has been growing actually during the pandemic, which is interesting. So hopefully the more militant leadership will emerge in the unions, but the support has been very consistent. And also the same Canadian Union of Postal Workers was the first union to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions in relation to the Palestinian struggle. And other unions have done that as well. So that's starting to happen now.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. Again, I want to encourage people to, if they have questions, please put them in the chat. I'll remind people to subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking the red subscribe button, and to check out Socialist Action at socialistaction.org. And you had mentioned that in your presentation, the mass mobilizations that were taking place around the AIDS epidemic, confronting the FDA. I'm reminded of course, our present period, where we are in the midst of a global pandemic with a different form of coronavirus, SARS-2. What can we, and again, this is for either panelist, what could we learn from maybe this moment, this pandemic moment that we're in now, and the pandemic of the AIDS crisis? Go for it, Anne.
Try. I mean, it's very different. I mean, there are a lot of things that were very different because there was total silence. And I was thinking about it, because so often the Democratic Party, their job is to take a social movement and just destroy it, take it over and then dumb it down so bad that the demands aren't even recognized by the people who make the demands. But nobody was talking about it. So they couldn't even take over the movement because they weren't even mentioning that it exists. So there was, no one was talking about it. But it just seems like, so it was different. One of the things that they won, which I don't think has ever happened again, was the fact that the actual people who, who are fighting the FDA, they finally got to have a seat. And this whole issue was around the trials, and they said we're going too slowly, and finally they said, okay, if the medication is not toxic, and there are people that don't have any other option. I mean, because people were dying, they come into the hospital and they were dead in 2 weeks, and they never got it, they didn't qualify for the trial. And there's a name for it. I just saw it, parallel something, which this is done now. it's achieved. It's something that they do, but they were so stultified and so bureaucratic. I guess the main connection is Tony Fauci. I don't know. I noticed Tony Fauci, because it was the 40th anniversary of ACT UP or whatever. And I think it was Rachel Maddow, because she was in ACT UP, and she was interviewing him and about it, and I thought it was sort of interesting. He referred to ACT UP as theatrics, but I didn't think he felt that way when the smoke bomb was going off outside, outside his office. But, and a lot of people felt like eventually, he was helpful and he listened to them, but he was such a bureaucrat, and I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. It's hard for me to think of an analogy, because I guess it was so multifaceted. It's we could say there are communities of color that are having a hard time accessing vaccines, and of course, there still is no vaccine for HIV.
John, would you like to thank you, Ann. John, would you like to expand on this?
Yeah, I think that maybe one area where you could compare the two, although there was very different periods, is that the pandemic has really exposed the nature of the system we live under. The massive inequality. There's been big conflicts in Canada over compensation and help from the federal and provincial governments. And for example, in the province I live in Ontario, it was quite obvious that the more affluent sections of the province got vaccines faster than anybody else. Well, they talked about targeting, obviously the incidence of people actually contracting COVID was much higher in working class communities, particularly recent immigrant communities and racialized communities. And there was a lot of struggle over that, and so there was some improvement in the situation. We have a very reactionary government in the province right now. It's a bit comparable to the Trump phenomenon. They didn't run as a hard right government, but that's how they've acted since they got in, and they're sort of like a carbon copy of the Republicans in a lot of ways. They lie through their teeth at every moment. Well, of course, the Democrats do too, but the Republicans maybe are a little bit better at it. I don't know. But it really has exposed that the ills of the system that we live under, and the contradictions and the oppression of the system. And that's reflected in recent polls, I think, both in the U.S. and Canada. And more people are saying that they're favorable towards socialism. I mean, what they understand by that is probably quite buried, and maybe in some cases not terribly accurate, but certainly there's growing opposition of the whole system. I mean, you can see that. And it's actually reflected in Socialist Action Canada and the growth that we've been experiencing, in particular, getting a lot of new and younger members.
Fascinating. Thank you. So I really am enjoying this discussion, by the way. This is very enlightening and extremely valuable in this period. And I think I'm going to go to a topic that it's still being debated and has been for decades. And you mentioned earlier the mass attack on collective identity that is plaguing the LGBTQIA plus communities. And this is touching on the topic of identity politics specifically. And can both of you expand on this idea of where identity politics fits into the struggle for LGBTQI liberation, the ways it inhibits it, if at all, and what we can learn from the struggles around identity politics in the past and also today. And John, would you like to take that first, and then we'll have Ann go next?
Okay, yeah, that's been a problem, and it's a problem in other struggles as well. Is the sort of fetishization of identity without any connection to class or the class or racism, misogyny, etc., and homophobia. And they don't tie these things together, particularly academics that are into identity politics and what they call intersectionality. Neither of which term was invented by them. I believe the term identity politics was, if I can recall correctly, it was an article in Monthly Review, not a long while back. It was by a lesbian feminist collective known as the Combahee River Collective. And they were talking about how it's important, the identity is important. It's important in forming resistance and consciousness. But it can't be the whole ball of wax. I mean, it just doesn't work. You can't operate on the politics of anger without an analysis and a program. And there's no connection between the identity politics that a lot of people are putting forward and the working class as a whole. It just isn't there.
Well said, John. Thank you. Ann?
Well, yeah, he said it really well. It made me just think about, it's really connected what we're talking about in terms of the neoliberal LGBT movement as a whole. Like we have the Human Rights Campaign, for instance, which is just horrendous. They have the inequality index, and number one was like Walmart, so it was like they're just a total kind of a corporate, but they're very, identity politics, they are like right there. And even Pride at Work, which is unions, they put out this thing, I can remember when they said it, they were going to endorse Kirsten Sinema in Arizona because she said she was a bisexual. And so we're going to give her money so she'll win, And I'd been in Arizona and I knew she opposed $15 minimum wage. How can you do, And it's, we just have seen that with all the Biden appointees. All they talk about is what their racial or cultural identity is. And it's just part of the neoliberalism is just, totally taken over. And I'd like to know a way to, I kind of feel like at some point it's just going to all change, but I know it's probably may just be a process. And it just seems like unions are the only place where you can even really talk about collective action, and an injury to one is an injury, it's an injury to all. I just think it's the struggle we're in right now. And I don't exactly know what to do other than when there is a struggle out there to get involved and try to keep it away from just identity.
Indeed. Very well put, both you and Ann and John. And John, you want to expand on it more? Please go ahead.
Just a little bit. One of the examples of identity politics gone completely bonkers is that when Margaret Thatcher was elected, and for those who remember her, this was hailed by some people as a great advance for women. And there's actually a book which I think is very good on this question. It's called Mistaken Identity by Hayar Saeed. I've forgotten how you spell that, but anyway, it was reviewed in Monthly Review as well, I think. And I thought it was very good analysis of identity politics and its weaknesses.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of today, you know, Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, Black lesbian woman, the first Black lesbian mayor of Chicago, has presided over, you know, a police force that murdered Adam Toledo and deployed, you know, a militarized police force against the BLM, Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020. It is definitely the topic of identity politics is something that I think the movement is always going to have to contend with and struggle against in order to, as Anne mentioned, help achieve a collective identity that's based on the similarities that we have insofar as we are, you know, working class people, especially oppressed people, etc., have more in common than we have that separate us. You know, we have a common oppressor, and we have a common fight to try to change the system, the capitalist system, to that pits people against each other. It's baked into the system that capitalism pits, you know, Black workers against white workers, straight workers against gay, lesbian, and queer workers, etc. It's a age-old trick that, you know, only through collective, independent mass action can we achieve to overcome such a negative force against our own power, that can be realized quite suddenly. And, you know, with that said, I'm reminded of, you know, going back even further into history, specifically around the topic that we're discussing tonight, the radical history of pride. I wonder if the presenters this evening can discuss, you know, probably the seminal struggle of our movement, the Russian Revolution, and what that struggle contributed not only to workers of the world, but specifically to gay, lesbian, and trans workers. And I'm happy to have either one take that one first. John, I think you're unmuted. You want to go first?
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I think, well, first of all, the early Soviet Republic was the first major state on the planet to decriminalize homosexuality, along with abortion, and they made marriage something that was simply between individuals to register together as being married, not the state, not the church. This unfortunately was all reversed when Stalinism took power. But I think it you know, it showed what was possible, and that, you know, it did prove that the working class could overthrow and get rid of capitalist productive relations. So, well, that's about all I can think of right now, just off the top of my head.
Thanks. Anne, you want to go for it?
Yeah, I think it probably might relate to the women being involved in the revolution. And, you know, we always hear certain names, Kalontai, like maybe there were two women that we hear. But I read an article, there were like 10 major leaders in the Bolshevik movement that were women. And women, if I can put in a plug, women have to be involved in the Revolutionary Party. I mean, we can't just sit back and say, well, yeah, they know our issues are important. You know, we have to be in there working. And I'm sure that I believe that's why they did eliminate some of the laws prohibiting like homosexuality. I know they did. And then it's interesting for us to study why it was that Stalin eliminated all those things, you know, and but they're still important, you know. It's not like, well, they didn't last. It's important that it happened for the period of time that it did. And we know the history was complex, and we know it was a very difficult time for the Soviet Union, but there was also Stalin. And I think they said they went from, you know, the freedom, women's freedom, to, you know, having the Women Worker of the Year award, you know, sort of thing. But yeah, I think and of course the women were involved very early, the garment workers, it was garment workers in Petrograd. And I just think I'm a big believer in that we need to know all of our history, and that there are parts of our history that that we don't know. And I'm against rewriting of history also. Just put in that I'm against rewriting history. And so we want it to be as accurate as possible.
Very, very fascinating. I know that we're running short on time, but I feel like we would be remiss, given that we all here live on occupied territory, Turtle Island. And can we just say something briefly, given the short period of time that we have, about the contributions and really a lot of the things that we're still fighting for today were already established by our Indigenous sisters and brothers that are in a lot of respects paved the way for where we're at now, and point the way forward for specifically this LGBTQI struggle.
Well, the only thing
like to feel that. Anne, go ahead.
Sorry. The only thing that I really think of is care for the earth, and that affects all of us. And you know, I spent some time around Tucson and in Arizona, and you can see where Tucson was divided. The railroad tracks are what divided Tucson between what was in that time the United States and their land. And I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for, but I just think care for the earth and care for all of us, each other, is and remembering, you know, what we did to the genocide. And I know they've had instances in Canada recently that really brought that to the fore.
Thank you, Anne. John, would you like to? I'm not sure if my question was clear, but I can clarify if you would like me to.
I think I sort of get the direction that you're going in. I agree with Anna. The care for the environment and for the earth is a very major element. It's an example of the advanced nature in some ways of indigenous cultures. But also there was the acceptance. So basically, they accepted people for who they were. For instance, they don't subscribe to the binary when it comes to gender relations. As a matter of fact, there was an article in the paper, one of the papers in Toronto a while back, one of the corporate papers actually, talking about how a particular indigenous society, I think in the States somewhere, recognized 14 genders. Don't know what they all were, but anyway, you know, they accepted people for who they were, didn't even bother thinking about it particularly as it seems. And as well in their religions, indigenous religions, at least I'm somewhat familiar with some indigenous religions, religious ideas in North America. They're not like the religions that came out of class society, because these were not class societies, and they weren't patriarchal. So that's another example, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking specifically, John, what you mentioned, and your contributions are well taken too. I think when I read, for example, like Engels, The Origin of the Private Property in the State, you know, and the different relations that they had, and just thinking about anthropology and studies of, two-spirited people, Berdache, etc.,
Mhm.
and how that informs, the widening acceptance, I think, of gender variance now that's happening today. It seems that we have run out of time, and I want to thank our panelists, Ann Montague and John Wilson, for a very enlightening discussion at this webinar. And one final plug for Socialist Action. This webinar was organized and sponsored by Socialist Action. You can check us out at socialistaction.org. And I want to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel down there at push the subscribe button. We are not going to have a webinar next Wednesday, but the following Wednesday we'll have one. Check out our Facebook page and our Instagram to find out the topic of that event. It'll be coming soon. And with that said, thank you everybody for watching, and have a wonderful evening.